Okay, I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show Lynne Kiesling, who is an associate professor of instruction in economics at Northwestern University. And she does some fascinating research in the world of energy, which, of course, is a hot topic in Israel. Lynne, a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, a lot of times people talk about the future of energy efficiency, which is a big part of what you study. Why does that matter?
Energy efficiency matters for a few reasons. One is that both because of technology and because of population growth, we, over the past, say, 50 years, have increasingly globally been consuming more energy in total. But if we pay attention to energy efficiency on kind of a per person basis or on a per dollar of economic value created, so like economic use divided by number of dollars of GDP, say, that means that those two measures of efficiency basically mean we are getting the most value out of a given amount of energy. And since energy is in many ways scarce, because we tend to, and I study electricity, we tend to generate our electricity mostly using non-renewable sources, and sources that cause some concerns about pollution and greenhouse gases and geopolitical things, that getting the most value, getting the most bang for your buck out of every unit of energy you consume is really important. So economically important, environmentally important.
So let's focus a little more on that, because as someone who's not an expert in the greenhouse effect, although I read about it in the press, and I get the feeling when I read both sides of the equation that there's a lot of politics going on here, and frankly, not a lot of interest necessarily in the good of the people. So if you're talking about saying, well, I want to have more efficiency in one area or another, it seems that there are a lot of technologies which are just being ignored instead of actually being developed.
I think there are a lot of political toings and froings in the various things around climate change. And one of the things that I get concerned about when I look at policies in the U.S. and internationally is the effect of the politicization of the issue on science. And what does this do to our sort of quest for truth, if you will, that science is supposed to represent? And there are technologies, and one thing that I would argue for, and that I argue for in my own work, is that having low barriers to innovation and allowing for a lot of experimentation and questioning and testing and innovation in energy technologies is likely to set us up to best be able to deal with whatever the effects are going to be of changes in greenhouse gases and global warming, climate change. And so
it sounds very ideal. It would be great if we could have a low barrier to entry and lots of entrepreneurs could come up with new ideas. But what we seem to happen is that the politicians come in and either they support, let's say, a solar energy plant to the tune of $500 million, and they get a lot of bad press about it, or they, at the same time, they're using that money for whatever their pet project is instead of another project. It seems like your idea is an ideal, but we're moving exactly in the opposite direction. Is there any hope?
In some ways, I think we are, and in other ways, we aren't. I take a lot of inspiration, both in terms of formulating the ideas for a future in energy markets that is very decentralized and where both consumers and producers have a lot of ability to experiment and search and create new technologies and experiment with new technologies, but also personally, in terms of my personal interest in the issues, I take a lot of inspiration from what we've achieved with digital technology, and that the model that digital technology and the internet provides for us to think about different ways to structure and organize business models and regulatory models, even in an industry like electricity, where you've got a pretty serious built fixed capital wires infrastructure. There are different ways that we can arrange our business models and regulatory models to induce people to experiment with the kind of technologies that can simultaneously be both cleaner and allow for a prosperous, thriving economy.
We're speaking with Lynne Kiesling, who is at Northwestern University in the economics department. She writes a lot about energy and energy efficiency. We've been talking up till now about the question of whether efficiency is important and how political is it. Lynne, you mentioned something that really kind of struck a chord, and you made a comparison between energy, or in particular electricity, and digital technology. They seem so different. When you sign up for your local utility company, you don't have a choice. There's only one company who put the wires there, unlike with digital technology where it's all around. How do you make that comparison?
That's a great question. And it's true that when you think about it physically, there's one set of distribution wires. And if you think about it physically, when you think about electricity, it is a flow of electrons. But one of the things that I think we've learned from the internet is to think about the network as a platform. And so that physical network of wires, there's an analog in the internet, which is the wires there that create the kind of physical platform of the internet. And with all the digital innovations, what we've seen is that we can have these technology layers on top of that, right? One next layer up is going to be the TCP/IP protocol, and that's what enables devices to talk to each other using a shared interface, a common understanding of what the data mean on both sides of the communication. And then you build applications on top of that, and so on and so on and so on. And the next thing you know, you've got, Snapchat and Instagram and all sorts of.
So you're describing the digital side, which I buy into 100%. Right. How does that apply to electricity?
So how does that apply to electricity? Let me put it in a little bit of context first. At least here in the U.S., one of the issues that is in pretty heavy discussion among regulators and utilities is something called grid defection, which is as the digital smart grid technologies to enable us to automate and manage the electric grid better, and distributed energy resources like rooftop solar panels, things like that. The more prevalent those become and the more widespread they become, and the easier they are to install and the cheaper they are for end-use customers, the concern is that then more people are just going to rely on their own distributed generation, and they'll just go off grid. And the utilities have all of these sunk investments in the wires network, and so they're concerned that their customers are going to leave. They're going to be stuck holding the bag in terms of the wires capital costs. My argument is that if we instead think in terms of a business model where the utility sees its wires as a platform for enabling interaction and enabling transactions, and in particular enabling the connection of different customers around the edge of the distribution network, that wires network is going to continue to have value. And what you can do is, say, enable those people who have those distributed generation resources to buy and sell energy from each other.
It sounds nice that it smooths it out that way, but it's not necessarily the experience we've had like with the phone companies who had lots of sunken costs and putting up copper wires, and all of a sudden the government came in and started regulating it, and they couldn't necessarily make the money, and then the internet came along and said, hey, we want to use those wires and not pay.
Yeah, and that's the sense in which I agree with you, and I think you're right that I'm kind of putting a theoretical stake in the ground and saying, here's a business model, here's a regulatory model that involves very light-handed regulation, but can enable all of these distributed people around the edge of the distribution network to create value, and create value for themselves and for each other by connecting them through exchange on this physical wires platform, and then building a market platform on top of it. So one way to think of it, and I'm not the first person to say this, but is to think of this as an Airbnb for electricity or Uber for electricity.
Right. It certainly is smart. It sounds a little bit, at least at this stage in the world, a little bit philosophical. Lynne, we're just about out of time, but I know that you do write more about perhaps more, I don't want to say more practical, but real changes that we might see soon. So in the last few seconds, just tell us, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Yeah, I follow this industry constantly. I have a blog where my colleague Mike Giberson and I write occasional posts. It's called Knowledge Problem, and it's at knowledgeproblem.com. And I also am on Twitter as @KnowledgeProb. And then I have my own website, which is www.lynnekiesling.com. And those are probably the best places to keep up with what I'm thinking about.
Okay, so we will put links to all of that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Lynne, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.